Session 3 is titled Optimizing Policy Simulation for its Intended Purpose. We'll have some presentations and we will have a Q&A session. The speakers are from the UK Defence Science and Technology Laboratory, Mr. Michael Bagwell, Mr. Geoffrey Chapman, from the US National Defense University Defense Wargaming Center, Mr. Hyong Lee, and Ms. Selma Gomez-Orr. The commentator is Mr. Masahiro KURITA of Chukyo University. And the chair and moderator is Special Research Fellow Mr. MATSUURA, National Institute for Defense Studies. Greetings. I'd like to start the afternoon session. So please stay awake during this session after lunch. So policy simulation or wargaming, it has become more popular. It's becoming more used, and so more demands, like more complex scenarios, are emerging. Also, need for AI utilization. So higher fidelity is being asked for, and also more immersiveness is being pursued. And also there's a need to collect more precise data. So there's heightened needs for that, and that tends to make the games more complex. Now in this session, we're going to talk about optimizing policy simulation for its intended purpose. How do we optimize, and what are the efforts that are being pursued toward that goal? We have 5 experts here in this session who will share their knowledge and expertise, and we'll have some discussions. So from the First Connections Japan, we have been participated by our counterparts, the UK Ministry of Defense Science and Technology Laboratory, Dstl, and we have Mr. Michael Bagwell and Mr. Geoffrey Chapman. And from the US, there's a National Defense Wargaming Center at the National Defense University. Used to be called Castle, but it's now called National Defense Wargaming Center, NDWC. From that organization, we have Dr. Selma Gomez-Orr and Mr. Hyong Lee. And from Chukyo University, we have lecturer Mr. Masahiro KURITA, our former colleague. We used to do wargaming together. So he will serve as a commentator. To repeat, those watching online, you can use the chat function to send questions. You can register your questions. We may not be able to answer all of the questions submitted. So first, we would like to have a presentation from the UK. Mr. Bagwell, please.
Thank you. I'd like to start by thanking NIDS for the opportunity to come out here and to present to you. As you've heard, we've been here since the first Connections Japan, and we found each of them to be incredibly useful to helping us understand international wargaming capabilities and get feedback on the work that we do. And we're immensely grateful for the dialogue and collaboration. Our presentation today is in 2 parts. I'll start by briefly describing how we assure wargames at Dstl and some of the tools that are being developed within the UK wargaming enterprise to aid our assurance efforts. I'll focus specifically on some of the methods that we use to evaluate wargames to ensure that we understand the impact of the design choices we make and on the significance of the game outputs. And then Geoffrey will talk about how we put some of that thinking into practice using a worked example. Within UK Defence, we're in the process of developing what we call the Analysis-Led Wargaming Framework, or ALF. It has its origins in work done by our industry partners in BAE Systems, and is now being developed jointly by BAE Systems, Dstl, and our partners in the Defence Experimentation and Wargaming Hub, which is part of the UK MOD. It addresses an identified need for us to more systematically embed rigor into wargames designed for analysis. It provides a common framework and terminology for thinking about and describing all types of analytical game, which makes discussions about games and collaboration on wargaming easier across the whole of the defence wargaming enterprise. Whilst recognising that there are many different types of wargame and many analytical techniques that can be applied to them, the ALF outlines the key components that are common to all analytical wargames, and it provides guidance on how to produce those components. And finally, and perhaps most relevant to this presentation, it provides a number of assurance tools that can be used throughout the wargaming lifecycle. So this is what the core of the ALF looks like. In the interest of time, I'll not describe in detail how it works now. The key point to note is that it describes a number of delivery activities, analysis activities, and assurance activities that must take place across the life cycle of a wargame, from its initiation through its design and execution to its analysis and reporting. Crucially, at the heart of this diagram are analysis activities. As the name of the framework suggests, the game design must be led by the analysis that the game is going to support. It should not be the other way around. The game design should not dictate the analysis that is done. So to summarize, the framework outlines a process that starts with the research question, identifies the analysis that must be done to answer it, and then designs a wargame that will produce the right data for that analysis. As I mentioned, the ALF has a number of tools that help us assure the analysis that we do using wargames. One of these is what we call the Evidence Framework Approach, or EFA. The EFA was developed by Dstl to improve the use of evidence to support decision-making. It provides handrails to support those responsible for assessing the quality of evidence. We've modified and extended the EFA to better tailor the approach to the evaluation of analytical wargames within the ALF. The EFA is a subjective framework, but its use allows analysts to make informed judgments about the quality of outputs a wargame design has produced or which it is expected to produce. The ALF recommends the EFA is used near the start of the wargame lifecycle and again near the end. At the start, the EFA can help inform conversations with sponsors about the quality of outputs that are required. It can also help designers and analysts identify where changes in inputs, changes in design, or analysis techniques could improve confidence in the results. And at the end of the process, use of the EFA allows us to judge whether we've achieved the level of confidence we're aiming for, and if necessary, whether we need to caveat our findings. The EFA is made up of two tables. The first is the evidence profile table, and this assesses the evidential quality of findings through consideration of the characteristics of the evidence that goes into and comes out of a wargame. Assessors using this framework select the most appropriate profile in each level. This produces an overall score for the quality of the findings. The second table then focuses on the validity of the findings, which we define here as the relevance to what is being studied. And this again produces an overall score. These two scores are then combined into an overall confidence score, as shown here. It's important to note that confidence relates to fitness for purpose. For certain purposes, a low confidence score may be acceptable. And that might be the case where the outputs of a wargame are being combined with many other forms of analysis to produce an answer. Or it might be where the urgency of decision-making means that some sort of insight now is better than a much higher quality insight that's too late to influence decision-making. The important thing is to understand what limitations the design choices we make place on how we use the findings. We've also expanded the original EFA to dive more deeply into the validity of design of the game construct. This is currently a draft product that we're developing alongside our colleagues within the Defence Experimentation and Wargaming Hub and BAE Systems. This product expands upon and complements the EFA by providing more focus on how wargame design choices shape the quality and utility of wargame outputs. It helps drive conversations about the relevance of wargame design to the research question. and it helps identify the impacts that changes to game design could have on the quality of outputs who have relevance to a question. The design validity assessment considers 7 factors. Firstly, whether the game represents the right system, whether the game design represents the game with integrity, that is, that the biases and inappropriate behaviors that players may exhibit have been accounted for, whether the game creates an environment that ensures players behave in a way that the designers intend and is needed for analysis, and whether the design makes appropriate use of the expertise that is present at the game. It also looks at the quality of the inputs, that the game design ensures that players make decisions in the games that are representative of reality and in a way that is appropriate for the research being done. And finally, it looks at the way that game mechanics are used in the game and considers whether those are an appropriate representation of the system for the purpose of the intended analysis. As with the EFA, the scores for these individual criteria are summed to provide an overall score for the validity of the game design. So to summarize, the analysis-led wargaming framework ensures that the wargaming lifecycle is driven by the analysis that wargaming is intended to support. Clearly established research questions and analytical plans must drive the design and not the other way around. The evidence framework approach and design validity assessments help validate the design choices made, suggest areas for improvement, and help us understand the impact of any changes we make to the wargame design. And together, these assurance approaches can help support decisions about streamlining and ensure the validity of games that have been streamlined. I'm now going to hand to Geoffrey to provide an example.
Thank you very much, and I'd also like to thank our hosts for this event. So, as Mike said, what I'll be presenting is our deterrence and escalation series of games, the background of these games, their findings, how we've gone about optimizing them, our future work, and how this has been guided particularly by the ALF and the Design Validity Assessment. So the background of the Deterrence and Escalation series is that it's been part of a multi-year research program funded by the Secretary of State's Office for Net Assessment and Challenge. It started in August 2021, and it had wargaming as its analytical heart. As part of the activities, this included multiple analytical wargames conducted in conjunction with historical case studies, and analysing these results of the wargames alongside the historical case studies as pseudo-empirical case studies. The overall aim was to understand, or better understand, our understanding of escalation dynamics across the spectrum of escalation in order to better apply our deterrence approach more strategically. As part of this, we had 4 main research questions. That is to understand the factors, strategies, longer-term considerations, and how different geographies could impact escalation dynamics. However, the secondary objective as part of this research program was to understand how we could better integrate wargaming as part of an analytical research process. And in this, we had to evaluate the relative strengths and weaknesses of wargaming as a research methodology. So we are very familiar with historical case studies, but these have a number of limitations. That, of course, we are limited by the amount of empirical data that exists, particularly at high escalation levels. There's a rich theoretical literature, but there's a limited academic consensus about how escalation occurs in the real world. However, analytical wargames provide us the potential of generating this pseudo-empirical data as long as we are able to validate it against real-world data. So how we went about this is validating our game against the empirical data that we had in the historical case studies and the literature review of the academic literature. And when we had confidence in the output of both the literature review and the wargames, this provided us confidence in the data we were generating from our wargames. So in terms of what our wargames look like, as part of the series that we ran for SONAC, we ran 5 Euro-Atlantic games and 1 Indo-Pacific game, and we've also conducted a number with our partners with NIDS. These consist of multi-day affairs when they are conducted at full scale, with each turn conducted over the course of 2.5 hours, broken down into multiple phases. During each turn, players strategize, negotiate, and submit orders. We also have operational mechanics establishing facts on the ground as well. However, all the way throughout our games, we have a systematic data capture approach which captures insights into why players are making particular decisions, so we can retrospectively analyze the motivations of our players throughout the course of the game. While we're satisfied with the method, it did produce a number of positives in terms of how we were able to collect the data throughout the course of the game, meant that compared to even historical case studies, we were able to drill into insights as to why players were making decisions at any given moment. We're also able to run multiple iterations of the same game to provide insights as to why particular decisions were made and whether there were different outcomes that could be generated. However, the analytical games had their limitations. As discussed perhaps in the first panel, these type of war games are particularly labor-intensive and time-intensive to set up. They're very time-intensive also to analyze the outputs thereafter. And in terms of creating the scenario and understanding whether outputs are valid requires a high degree of expertise. Also, in terms of analyzing concrete strategies, this also requires input from particular subject matter experts beforehand and may not be responsive to particular events that could occur within a game. And even after multiple iterations of the game, we're only able to answer a subset of the potential question space that we could have looked into from our war games. But nonetheless, the war games provided a new and exciting way of establishing empirical insights alongside our historical case studies. With those limitations in mind, we therefore set about trying to streamline the D&E method so we could perhaps run them more frequently and cheaply as to minimize those negatives. Often the games were very expensive to run and time intensive, so we were wanting to limit those costs. So we wanted to create a way of repeating the same sort of games, but on a more limited basis. And having confidence in the overall method due to our previous work with the historical case studies and literature review, we believed that the deterrence and escalation method was a good candidate to start with. This process occurred at the beginning of last year, where we ran 3 trial games that were running on a kind of simplified version of the deterrence and escalation rule set, mechanics, and data capture approach. And these were initially successful, running 3 games early in the year. And we established confidence in running this approach. This confidence also led us to trial several different microgames approaches with different sorts of games, including a war game series conducted over the course of several kind of evolving instances, this federated series of games, emulating internal dynamics of particular actors, and also shorter, more limited experimental games looking at the variation of key variables. So in terms of streamlining the D&E method, the way in which this worked was narrowing down on particular research questions, rather than simulating a full crisis and all the complexity thereof, looking at a particular subset of a question relating to this crisis, so narrowing down. On a strategic level, rather than having all the actors that could potentially be involved, potentially in the blue cell with lots of allies involved, this would mean looking at a limited number of actors, the key actors, and grouping other actors together. At the operational level, rather than perhaps giving players freedom of movement in terms of their forces, this would be simplified to a node-based wargame where players would have a limited number of decisions relating to how to array their forces. Data capture was also reduced. Based on the insights that we gathered from the full games, we could focus on key questions, but we could also automate some aspects of data capture, integrating IT into our process. We could also merge the operational and strategic orders so players could focus on the high-level decision-making. As a result of these simplifications, a reduction in personnel involved, we're able to reduce the typical turn length down from 2.5 hours to 1 hour. Now, in terms of how this relates to the ALF, we're able to retrospectively analyze how valid the microgame version of deterrence and escalation is compared to the full version. we can have confidence that the inputs remain the same in terms of the assumptions about the underpinning mechanics and the scenario that go into the game. Also have confidence in the integrity of what we are simulating, in that while there might be differences in player behavior compared to large groups, compared to small groups, we have greater transparency over the decision-making in small groups. When it comes to the functionality of the game, this does somewhat differ, but when we simplify the research questions and look at a specific subset of a research question, we can have confidence that we have the intended functionality of a limited part of the research question we are looking at. This also applies to systems complexity, where if we have a lowered fidelity of the simulation that we are running, we are lowering the fidelity of parts of the game that are not necessarily directly relevant to the simulation. In terms of the subject matter expertise, while we are making a certain amount of assumptions and simplifying it for the wargame, we can also adjust these so that they're not directly impinging upon the research question. In terms of the operational mechanics, we are also simplifying them so they do not impact the research question overall. So the emphasis returns to, if we can match the research question to the simplifications, we believe that the simplified microgame version of deterrence and escalation can be a valid way to explore research questions. Therefore, when thinking about the microgame method, we believe that we can have confidence in using microgame versions to either rapidly explore a problem space which could be expanded upon in a more complex game later, to run a playtest of a higher complexity game that we playtest later, or if we are running complex games, repeat a higher fidelity game at reduced cost to assess the validity of findings from that wargame, and analyze the sensitivity of the findings derived from a higher validity game to assess the variation in outcomes that could occur. In terms of how we will be applying this technique, we will be working with NIDS to run a complex game tomorrow, and then over the course of the next week, we'll be running several micro games to understand aspects of variation that could come from this complex game. This could include running perhaps a direct repeat of the high fidelity scenario to see whether there would be changes in terms of the outcome, whether we would reverse back and change a key variable at the beginning, or whether we could extend the timeline, or whether we could explore an alternative pathway coming from an inflection point within how we ran the complex game. With that, I'd like to thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bagwell and Mr. Chapman. So moving on, from the United States and NDWC, we're going to have a presentation. So Dr. Selma Gomez and Mr. Hyong Lee, please.
Right. Thank you very much. On behalf of Dr. Orr and myself.
Well, thank you very much for inviting us.
And thank you for ChatGPT for helping me out. So this is our standard disclaimer. The views and opinions that Dr. Orr and myself express here are completely our own and does not reflect that of any governmental agency back home. Just a quick overview of our biographies. Dr. Orr has a PhD in decision sciences from Harvard University, and she has a pretty broad experience in the private sector, academia, and government. Myself, I've been with the Department of Defense since I graduated from college, and have been with National Defense University from 2002. So when we talk about optimizing strategic simulations for what we want to achieve, we have to optimize it towards something. And when we talk about game design, we always talk about starting with purpose and objectives. And with these two key elements, that leads to your design. And that is how you start off with trying to get the most bang for your buck. So with a purpose for a game, when you define it at the outset, is a very short bumper sticker description of why you want to have a game. And from there, it leads to the objectives. And the objectives are an intermediate step between the purpose and design. Objectives goes into a little bit more concrete details of what you want to get out of this game. And when you start talking about design, it is more than just a scenario that you fell in love with. These design decisions are defined by the decision-making processes that's within the game, some of the constraints that you will have to grapple with, the trade-offs and priorities that you have to deal with that are linked to these objectives. Constraints could be a matter of time, money, the number and types of participants, and it's these design constraints and decisions that you make which will help you achieve that maximization of what you can do with the time you have, with the people that you can get there, and with the level of subject matter expertise that they may or may not possess. So what Dr. Ori and myself will talk about is how we use the operational wargaming system as a key element in some of our game designs. Now, for those who are not familiar with OWS, we have an example of OWS in one of the demonstration rooms here. But it is a hex encounter manual war game that was developed by Marine Corps Warfighting Lab, and is now taken over by Marine Corps University. And it is a game system that looks at force-on-force operational level operations. OWS is being used by a number of joint professional military education schools, both in the United States and in our partner and allied countries, as well as within the analysis community. So back in 2024, I was responsible for running the capstone exercise for the College of Information and Cyberspace. CIC is one of the schools in NDU. And for this capstone exercise, you see on the far left here, the purpose. The purpose of this exercise is, it was an end-of-year exercise, and it was for the students to demonstrate what they have learned throughout the course of the entire year. So that was a very simple purpose, the why of having this exercise. And you can see some more detailed objectives of what we want to see from these students. How do they actually demonstrate what they have learned throughout the year? Well, we want to see them apply key strategic concepts. We want them to demonstrate that they know the roles, responsibilities, and some of the capabilities of using the instruments of national power across the diplomatic, information, military, and economic domains. And also, we want to see the students apply principles of strategic leadership. So those are our objectives. And then from those objectives, we focus on the design. What are those game mechanics that we can incorporate in order for them to demonstrate all these objectives? So first, we used a matrix game system that we have developed called Flashpoint. And the Flashpoint matrix game system was designed for them to demonstrate some of this strategic level thinking across the dime, that the students would set the Indo-Pacific theater based upon some of their strategic interests as they role-played multiple countries that have a stake in this region. So we are talking with the United States, China, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and the ASEAN states, among others. Well, since this is also the School of Information and Cyberspace, we need to see them demonstrate their understanding of the cyber realm and how to incorporate it at the strategic level. So Flashpoint and OWS did not have any inherent capabilities to demonstrate some of the more nuanced thinking that we want from the students. So we turned to a tool set called Merlin that was developed by the Center for Naval Analysis. And it was Merlin was the tool set that they used to demonstrate some of that strategic level thinking when it comes to cyberspace. And then we use OWS for the students to fight the fight that their strategic decision-making have set the theater for. So this is where OWS really shine, is to show the operational consequences of their strategic actions and thinking. And of course, our constraints were we had 4 seminars of students, and each seminar had about 12 to 13 students. So that required us to have 2 different worlds. And fortunately, we were blessed with having 6 days of gameplay. So we have a lot of time in order for the students to think deeply and hard about some of the decisions that they have to make. So this is a quick overview of what the Flashpoint matrix system looks like. On the left-hand side, you see our rule set. The very basic core of our rule set is just 1 page, relatively simple. But you see the countries that are represented by the students, by the various flags there. Another key feature of Flashpoint is that because of the team makeups, there is an asymmetrical capabilities among the various teams. Some teams have more capabilities than others, and for the ASEAN team, they had to deal with alliance and consensus dynamics and requirements among their decision-making. This is an example of OWS with the Merlin Tradecraft card. On the left-hand side is a picture of what the operational picture looked like for the region. And of course, it is extremely complex. On the right-hand side is an example of what the cyber tradecraft card looks like, and this is what the students had to grapple with. What is the target of their cyber activities? What is the effect that they're trying to achieve? And how are they going to do so? So this is where we gave the students an opportunity to demonstrate what they have learned from their classes when it comes to cyber operations.
Thank you, Hyong. Good afternoon, and it is an honor to be here, and I wanted to add my thanks to Hyong's, to our hosts here at NIDS. I'm a wargamer at the National Defense University, and my job is to support our faculty in their curriculum and to devise and design games that assist them in doing that. Hyong started off by mentioning the operational wargaming system, which is the basis of my discussion here today. For an exercise that we were conducting for the National War College, the faculty felt that the game was too operational and wanted their students to engage at a more strategic level. So our job was to define an exercise that the students could engage in before they played OWS that allowed them to make some of those strategic decisions across the instruments of national power, and then have to live with those consequences of those decisions when they played the OWS game. So we developed at the National Defense Wargaming Center what we call the strategic layer to the OWS game. And what this strategic layer does, it's a tabletop exercise that allows students to make decisions several years into the future about foreign policy, military policy that will be important in setting the stage for any kind of conflict. So what you see above here is the game board for the strategic layer. And essentially it has 2 different parts. And I'm going to walk you through how to play this game in a sense to provide a virtual demo of this actual exercise. Okay. Thank you. So on the left side of the board, there are 4 columns, and each column is directly linked to whether it is diplomatic engagement, information partnerships, military cooperation, and economic assistance. So the students were given many, many cards that represented countries in the region. This particular game board was for the blue player. There was the same game board for the red player. And this one was specifically set in the Indo-Pacific region. And so this is just a sample of how one group decided to go ahead and make their decisions about where they would prioritize certain countries over a 5-year period in order to help set the theater for any kind of conflict. So students would then take all the country flags, have very heated discussions sometimes about which country to put in each of those columns. Obviously, there are only a few slots. And so the discussion becomes very strategic about which country do you put in each slot. Now, the different countries, depending on the strength of the relationship to the blue player, have been given a die that has a number of sides, anywhere from 4 to 20 sides. Stronger relationship would be a multi-sided die, 20 sides. Because the way the game is evaluated, adjudicated, once the discussions have gone through and the students have placed the country flags, is that they roll a die depending on the strength of that particular country, and they must beat a 4, meet or beat a 4. So if you're rolling a 16-sided die, you have much more probability to meet or beat a 4 than if you are rolling a 4-sided die. So the idea is that then these sorts of prioritizations that have been made for different countries along each of those dimensions would potentially then, in the game, provide key features such as access spacing and overflight. Could be based on diplomatic and economic priorities that were made. So as the students roll the die for each one of these country flags, they either have success or failure. The ones that have success, we use a translation matrix to say if you succeeded in this country in diplomatic engagement, this in the OWS game is what you will receive. And so students are required to make these decisions because if you think about it, access spacing and overflight is critical. And it allows students to understand if they don't achieve where they want in particular countries, what a handicap that can be in a conflict. So that is the left side of the board. Then the next slide shows you what happens on the right side of the board. And this could easily be adjusted for your purposes. So on the right side of the board, I know it's very difficult to see, so I'll just mention the different areas there. There are key strategic decisions about separate from the engagement across instruments of national power that can be made. And I will go ahead and just for the purpose of discussion here, the first column looks at strategic priority intelligence requirements. And students receive many, many cards with different things under that heading where they can invest. For example, one item under that heading could be to learn about your adversary's non-kinetic effects capabilities. So students who prioritize that under that column would put that card in the column. They have a selection of many different cards to put under that column for category. And for the next column that we have is economic policy focus, one option, for example, that students could put in that column is defense industrial collaboration. And the final column in this particular board is theater posture. And one card that could be played in that area is increased freedom of navigation operations. So essentially, students receive all of these cards that give them strategic decisions they can make now that enhance their position for the future. They have many, many cards in each of the columns, but you see they only have a certain number of choices that they can make. So there's a lot of discussion among students in terms of trying to identify what are our true priorities. And then it is a very similar system to the one I described with the country flags. Each card has a color associated with it, and that color ties back to a die. So the items or the cards with green writing, they get a 10-sided die. And so they roll a 10-sided die to meet or beat a 4 to determine if they in turn have that success for that effort. So we have a matrix that we don't let the students see, where we take the results of what's on the board and turn it into specific things in the OWS game. And as I mentioned before, a lot of the results along diplomatic and economic engagement turn into access basing and overflight in different countries that the students are allowed to have. So it was something that professors wanted them to go into the OWS game understanding that there's some important strategic decisions that can be made beforehand that influence and set the theater for any conflict. So going on to our next example. So this exercise we ran both for our National War College and for our Eisenhower School. And this was an opportunity to use a digital platform before playing OWS. And there is a digital platform that we particularly use for this exercise. It's the Strategic Choices tool. It was developed by the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. And I'll describe it for the US, and then I have some slides because the tool exists also for Japan. So in the case of the US, this center, CSBA, took publicly available data about the defense budget of the US and the different platforms and programs that budget supports. And that is publicly available data over a 10-year period, 2 5-year cycles of the budget. In addition to that, they took that data, made that the baseline of what is in the tool. They went to industry experts for the defense industrial base and said, basically, if we were to increase purchases of certain platforms, what is the limit in terms of how much could be done in a 5-year period, how much is allowable to be purchased. We also looked at, inside the tool, you'll see, it allows you to divest from certain choices and see how that impacts the budget. So what we did in this exercise is we had a basic force laydown for a conflict the students were going to fight that was based on the US existing budget. Then we gave them this tool, this platform, and depending on the college, the National War College had an easier exercise because we told them, you get 150 billion more over 5 years. Where are you going to invest it? Right? And they also had the opportunity to expand that amount by divesting from things. They first looked at it from military department point of view and then overall for the budget. So this is, and I'll go into now, we'll go to the next slide. So I show you what the landing page looks like. This is for the Japanese version of the tool. There are different buckets for the different platforms and capabilities that you can click into each bucket, and then it gives you a listing of all the different platforms and capabilities available that you can think about making investment to or divesting from. The way the tool is set up is that when you see at the top the running total and target, the running total at 0 represents existing budget. It doesn't mean $0 or zero money. It is at the current level, it is 0, taking account of the current budget. Because what the tool does is it gives you the difference, the amount up that you are increasing above the budget or the amount down that you are getting from divesting from the budget. And it is a very interactive tool, so you can make these decisions and immediately see the results. Now, if we go to the next slide. So assuming I have clicked into the bucket for C, right, for maritime assets, under that bucket, I would have a listing under whatever the budget includes, all the different platforms that are currently being supported or are intended to be purchased. And I can click on individual platforms. For example, in this one, you have the Aegis-capable destroyers. What you're able to do is either increase, it tells you what the baseline, what currently is in the budget for purchase, right? It allows you to increase that amount if you feel that is an asset that you feel is very valuable, but only to a certain limit based on a constraint the defense industrial base says we can only supply this extra amount. It also allows you, on the other hand, to divest from other class of the destroyer that you may say, maybe these are more legacy systems and I don't want so many of them. And then it gives you back money because you've taken it out of the budget, and that money gets translated over time. So why did we run this exercise? And essentially the idea was we wanted students to grapple with the concept of what are your most valuable platforms? What are your crown jewels? And the idea that you have trade-offs. You have a set budget, and if you buy more of one thing, you're going to have to buy less of another. And making the students then really make those kind of analytical trade-offs and really prioritize thinking of the future, the design of the force of the future that you want. What should that look like? And where should you invest? And where should you cut? Should you be putting more money into R&D? And if so, into what particular programs? And so students were allowed to say, if I were in charge and I could redesign the force, where would I put that money? And what would I cut? Then we were a little bit mean to them, because in the next part is we said, okay, you made those decisions. Well, guess what? When you make a decision, you have to live with the consequences. And so we went ahead and said for all the choices that they made in the tool, right, about what they thought force design should be supported in the next 5 and 10 years, we went ahead and made, kind of using art and some assumptions and some science, we took what their decisions were about what they would change in the budget, what platforms they would support, what platforms they might want to retire, what they did with personnel, what they did with readiness, research and development, etc. And then we turned those decisions into specific tokens, game pieces in OWS. So that if they cut, a certain number of bombers, we kind of looked at, based on a variety of factors, the timeline of, where the forces might be spread, the timeline of getting new assets, flowing into theater. We took a variety of assumptions into account and then said, your baseline from the conflict is now different. You are getting more of these pieces and you're getting fewer of these pieces. And students then really could see some of those choices they made, how it impacted how they were able to play the game. And so the OWS game gave them the opportunity not to get the right answer, but to understand, when you made this trade-off, what risk did you assume? And to understand maybe where you might make a different choice in the future based on what you were able to see as you played the operational wargaming system. So that was an exercise that also allowed the students to kind of go through and understand, what are the key drivers for the budget? What are the most expensive platforms? Where are we really focusing our efforts? And allowed them to kind of look at the future and say, if you could change it, how would you change it? Next slide. Thank you. So in conclusion, it is really to speak to the point that OWS particularly is a gaming system that is only limited by the creativity of the game designers about the kind of strategic sort of decisions that you can ask game players to make, that then when they play OWS, they see the consequence of those decisions in a very kind of visceral way through direct experience. And I've given you a couple of examples of how we do that to provide that sort of strategic level thinking, decision-making for the students, and then operationalize it into living with those decisions.
And to add in, to that, just a couple of issues to think about. First, it's important to manage expectations. If you want to optimize any game, you optimize to the objectives of that game, not to some unrealistic expectations that the sponsor wants. And you have to be very honest about what you could achieve from the game. Also, managing resources, and we're talking about time, money, people, expertise, that you can optimize as much as you want, but you have to deal with some real-world constraints, which means that you have to make some trade-offs and prioritize what you're actually trying to achieve from that game. With that, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So we heard from the Dstl in the UK. So analytical game design. So it was a very systematic game design framework that was discussed. And this time, deterrence and escalation game that Dstl has, they applied that to that DNE. So from the US, we heard about this training for the students. And so OWS is the basis. And in each of the courses, how it is optimized, those examples, I think, were shared. Now, Kurita-san, can we have a brief comment from you, please? Yes. So as an external commentator, I'm here to deliver some comments. I'm with Chukyo University, but until recently, I was with NIDS. I was actually the moderator last year of the Connections last year. Well, thank you for the very interesting talk. And from myself, I'd like to talk about the high-level issue. And from high-level perspective, I'd like to provide 2 comments each to the presentations. First, about the Dstl presentation, I listened with great interest, especially, well, the game design has to be in line with the analytical objective. The game design should not dictate the content of the analysis. Based on the objective of the analysis, the game should be designed. I can emphasize that very strongly, but on the other hand, the outcome of the game, what do you want to analyze with the game? Based on that, design the game, and then also streamline the game. But if you do that, then once you play the game, the unknowns that the designer had not intended can, by chance, the chance of that appearing becomes lower. So how do you think about that analytical game? Should it be just to reach a conclusion that was intended, but the discovery of unknowns, you don't think about that? Is that how you think about it? But you have to think whether that is an acceptable position. So I want to ask about that to the speakers. And about the micro games, I thought that was also very interesting. So full-size deterrence and escalation game, that's very complex, so you streamline that. And you said that validity has been confirmed for that. But if I may say so, true, maybe micro game can cover the main parts, and it works as a game. And as was explained, the key factors that drive the decision making and the key actors, you just focus on those key factors and actors. And if you design the game around those key factors, then that becomes possible. I think that was explained. But conversely, what that means is that for the problem that the game is addressing, what are the key factors? Who are the key actors? You already have to know that in advance. You can only do that because you know the answer to that question. If that's the case, I mean, that would mean that this methodology can be, does it mean that the methodology can only be applied to the situations where you know the answer to that question? If that is the case, then isn't it quite limited where this game can be used? So is that the case is the second question. And then going on for the NDWC presentation, that was also very interesting by the two speakers. So thank you for that. So strategic level game and connection to the OWS. That was a very interesting part. And I took a look. I would like to take a look, and it would be very interesting if we can practice that. So there was the strategic priority game of the Indo-Pacific, and there was a connection to the OWS. So I want to ask a question about that. So OWS is focused on the military operations, a very narrow scope. So it's an operational game with a narrow scope. And then on the other hand, in the presentation, there was talk about the Indo-Pacific regional priority game. So that covers all the spectrum. So it's a very broad strategic level game. So the strategic level spectrum action there, that is converted to military factors on the OWS. I think that was how it was explained. But if that is the case, strategic level action exists, and then the players, if they're placed in a realistically same situation, then economically you should be focusing on the relationship with a particular country. But in the game, if that would not impact the factor on the OWS, you might take some other action, maybe to prioritize a collaborative relationship militarily with another country. So maybe that would distort the strategic layer choices in terms of actions. That is one concern I have. Of course, the strategic level game that's connected to the OWS. So strategic level actions, how that impacts the operation, that's the only thing you're focused on. So strategic level action, that may not be externally valid, and that is acceptable from the perspective of this game. But the strategic level valid actions and OWS, the military operation game, so there's that connection between those two different things. So how do you bridge that gap between the two? Those are the two questions.
Another question? This is just a simple question. After doing strategic level game, you do operational level game, and is there any initiative to do the other way around? For example, on OWS, you first look at military operations, and then for escalation control, you do a game of diplomatic negotiations. Is that also possible? Because the strategic actions affect operational level, but looking at operational level, you may want to adjust your strategic level action. Is there any plan or intent to do that kind of game? That is my question. Could the UK gentleman begin?
Thank you. Great reflections and great questions, as always. Thank you. So on this question of unknown unknowns, I think that's absolutely right. As you simplify a game, there is a danger that the mechanics of the game become so dominant in determining outcomes that you almost don't need the game, because you're optimizing on a design that produces almost a predetermined outcome. What I will say is that micro games are not intended to be a direct replacement for complex games. And really, the micro games that we run should exist in a world in which other forms of analysis and other forms of gaming are also being done to produce a complementary suite of answers. Not all the games that we run and not all the analysis that we do requires us to uncover those unknown unknowns. And so it comes back to the question of what are we trying to achieve? What are our objectives? If our objectives are to uncover those unexpected behaviours and activities, then we may actually still require a complex game. But if we're trying to do something where we're trying to test our hypothesis, or we're looking at a narrow situation, perhaps linking to this morning's presentations, if we're trying to relate what we're doing to something in game theory, then we might be more interested in having a repeatable series of games which ask a very narrow question, and we don't mind about not capturing that extra richness from an unknown unknowns. So really it is about having that sort of breadth of approach, but also being very clear about what you're trying to do with the games. Geoffrey, do you want to answer?
Thank you. And to respond to the question of limitations of microgames using them before we have run a complex game, I think this is very valid. But what it gives us a chance to do is kind of codify almost a playtest in advance of a main game. So to understand the kind of main dynamics of a scenario before we would then conduct a complex game. So appreciate the limitations, but it is a useful exploratory tool.
Thank you. And just kind of talk about, Selma and I talked about two different methodologies of having a strategic level discussions prior to going to the operational level of conflict. And then kind of talk about constraints of time. For the Flashpoint game, we had 4 days of strategic level gaming in order to set the theater for OWS. For the strategic layer mechanic, where you saw the flags, students only had 1 hour to do that. So that shows you the difference in the impact of constraints on how you create game design. Now, going from the strategic to, going from the operational to the strategic level of considerations. Yes, I think 1 year we actually did for one of the schools. They started off fighting the war in the Pacific with OWS, and they saw the high costs of doing the fight based upon what we think the baseline will be in the 2030 timeframe, 28 timeframe. And then once they saw the operational impact of our baseline forces, then they work backwards. What are some of the strategic changes that need to be made in order to avoid this conflict, right? But still on terms that are favorable to the U.S. and our partners and allies. Okay. So I think that's another way of using OWS and having that strategic discussion. Because when you see all those tokens and all those forces that's arrayed out there, and when you have to experience the consequences of that fight, then you really want to talk about, well, what can we do to avoid it, yet still secure our interests in the region.
And I did want to add, when we play the operational wargaming system, and hopefully you'll have a chance today to stop by to the demo that is down the hall here, one of the key things that we do at the end of the game is to conduct a discussion, an after-action discussion. And one of the kind of most interesting after-action discussions that I have seen is particularly when the students made some decisions about budget and changed the force design. Things like investing more in munitions or not, or retiring some bombers, or a variety of choices. When they played the game, then asking them, step back. You operationalized it. Now think back at the decisions you made. Would you have changed something as a result of that? So there's a lot of value to be gained in kind of completing the circle and going back to the original.
Thank you very much.